Have you ever wondered what stories the night carries? What memories drift through the darkness like soft breaths on a cool breeze? Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is the moon high above your yard? Or do the streetlights cast gentle shadows across your porch? Are you wrapped in a blanket? The quiet hum of the world, your only companion? Or perhaps you're listening from a warm kitchen, the scent of old coffee and sweet bread still lingering in the air. Wherever you are, whenever you're joining us, this story is for you. Let me know in the comments, what time is it there? Is it early evening when the sky still holds a hint of gold? Or is it the deep hush of midnight when even the wind seems to hold its breath? Tonight I'll take you on a journey not of kings and conquerors, but of the quiet lives that history forgot, of small moments, of humble hearths, of hearts that beat softly in the dark. It's a story of clay and fire, of gentle voices and the warmth of a flickering flame. But here's the thing, it's also a story of choices, of the weight of each breath, each step, each promise kept or broken. You might think it's just a story of the past, of ancient Egypt or dusty fields along the Nile, but I promise you, there's something more, something that hums in the spaces between words. Because when the night is still and the world grows quiet, we hear the echoes of those who came before us. We feel their hopes, their fears, their small triumphs and stubborn joys, and in their stories, we find our own. So stay with me tonight. Let this tale be a soft place to rest your thoughts. Let it be a balm for your tired mind, a gentle invitation to drift away from the weight of the day. And as you listen, I'll ask you, what are you searching for in the hush of this night? Is it comfort? Is it a spark of wonder? Or maybe just a moment to breathe, to remember that even in the quietest corners of the world, there is light, there is warmth. I'll share it all with you. Every flicker of the fire, every breath of the kiln, every heartbeat of the story. Let it fill your night with something deeper than sleep. And when the tale is done, if your eyes grow heavy and your dreams start to drift, leave me a note. Tell me where you listened from. Tell me if you felt the quiet glow of the past humming through your own heartbeat. Because tonight isn't just a story. It's a gathering, a gentle conversation across the miles. And it begins here with you. Stay with me, won't you? Let the night unfold. Let the story find its way to you. And let's see what warmth we can share together. The First Night by The Pottery Kiln. Imagine the hush of a quiet night when even your breath feels like a prayer. Picture yourself wrapped in a soft blanket, the flicker of firelight dancing across the walls. Outside, the Nile sighs softly in the distance, a silver ribbon under a pale moon. This is not a story of kings or conquerors. This is the story of Neferu, a young potter's daughter, and the quiet strength that glows like embers in the cold. Neferu sat by the kiln, a worn cloak around her shoulders. The night was cool, perhaps 50 degrees, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes the warmth of a small fire feel like a blessing. The air was scented with clay and wood smoke, a perfume older than any perfume in the world. She had never tended the kiln alone before. Her father Mentu usually kept watch, but he was away tonight, leaving her with the crackling flames and the quiet company of the river. The kiln was an ancient thing, built of sun-dried bricks and patched a dozen times over. It breathed like a living creature, exhaling heat and smoke with each fresh log she fed it. Neferu could feel its pulse in the soles of her bare feet, warm against the cool earth. She traced the lines of her hands, still dusted with red clay from shaping pots earlier that day. Each vessel, each curve carried the memory of her family's trade, a skill passed down through generations, like a song whispered in the dark. In the yard beyond the palm trees stirred in the night breeze. Their fronds whispered stories of distant lands and ancient days, a language Neferu had learned to listen to. She shifted the logs in the kiln, carefully mindful of the embers. Each crackle of wood was a promise hold, steady, keep breathing, and the fire will do the rest. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The kiln is alive, Neferu. It knows your touch. It remembers your breath. She smiled at the thought. Her father's voice was a comfort, even when he wasn't there. It made her feel less alone, less like a girl in the dark, and more like a keeper of something sacred. She reached for a small cup of barley tea, still warm from the evening meal. It tasted of earth and smoke the way nights like this always tasted. She took a slow sip, letting the heat fill her mouth and chest. Outside, the wind rustled through the reeds by the riverbank, a soft sigh that seemed to say, "You're not alone." Neferu looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright, tonight scattered like grains of salt across black velvet. She traced the constellations with her finger, Orion the hunter, the great river that mirrored the Nile. They had guided her ancestors across deserts and seas. Tonight, they guided her in the quiet art of tending fire. She shifted closer to the kiln, listening to the gentle hiss of the flames. She thought of the shapes waiting in the dark clay bowls and jugs, waiting to be born in the heat. Each one would carry the warmth of this night, the breath of the fire. She imagined them in the homes of her neighbors, a mother ladling stew for her children, a farmer sipping cool water after a long day in the fields. These humble pots were more than vessels. They were threads in the fabric of a life that stretched back farther than memory. Neferu's thoughts drifted to the stories her father told, by the fire stories of the old gods and the first potter who shaped the world from clay. She wondered if the gods still watched over these small, flickering fires, if they listened to the prayers of potters and farmers as closely as they did to pharaohs. She liked to think they did. In the hush of the kiln and the breath of the river, she felt a kind of quiet blessing, as if the gods were in the glow of the embers themselves. She shifted again, drawing her cloak tighter. The night was growing colder, the kind of cold that made her fingers stiff and her thoughts wander. She reached for another log, feeding it carefully to the fire. The glow flared bright for a moment, then settled back into a soft hum. It was a dance, this tending of the fire. A slow, patient dance, like the turning of the wheel when she shaped the clay. Each breath, each small motion was part of the rhythm of the night. The kiln's heat warmed her face, and she let herself lean into it just for a moment. The world felt smaller here, safer. Beyond the yard, the desert stretched out vast and silent. But here, in this small circle of light and warmth, she was not afraid. Here she was, the keeper of the flame, the quiet heart of her family's craft. She thought of her father out there, in the dark somewhere, trading pots for grain or oil. She hoped he felt the same warmth she did now, that he remembered the shape of the kiln's glow in the night. She hoped he knew she was strong enough to keep it alive, even in his absence. The night wore on. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the quiet yard. Neferu shifted her weight, resting her head against the rough wall of the kiln. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she forced them open again. She had a duty tonight to keep the fire breathing until dawn. She would not let it die. In that small, flickering circle of light, she found a kind of peace, a peace born of simple things. The warmth of fire the softness of clay, the steady pulse of her own breath. These were the things that kept her anchored, the things that would carry her through the long night. As the fire hummed and the stars watched silently, Neferu whispered a promise to the darkness. I am here. I am still breathing, and I will keep this flame alive. A breath of clay and memory. The night deepened. The kiln's breath glowed softer but steady. Neferu's own breath matched its rhythm, slow measured quiet as the river song beyond the yard. She shifted, drawing her blanket closer. Her eyes wandered over the simple things around her, the worn basket of kindling at her feet, the clay jugs stacked in the corner, the flicker of shadows on the rough walls of her small world. It was all so ordinary. Yet tonight, it felt like a kind of magic. The yard was hushed, holding its breath. Beyond the small circle of firelight, darkness pooled like ink, soft and thick. She could hear the quiet rustle of date palms, the far-off cry of a night bird, but mostly she heard the steady crackle of the fire. It was a sound she knew well, a comforter promise. In this warmth, she felt safe. In this quiet, she could hear the whispers of memory. She thought of her mother, long gone to the land beyond the river's end. Her mother's hands had shaped the same clay, tended the same kiln. On nights like this, Neferu could almost see her mother's gentle smile, feel the warmth of her presence in the hush between breaths. The clay remembers, her mother used to say. It holds the shape of your hands, the weight of your hopes. Neferu let her fingers rest on the rim of a half-formed pot. It was cool to the touch, smooth and waiting. In the firelight, it looked like a small moon, pale and still. She traced its curve with a slow tenderness, feeling the memory of her mother's touch in her own. The clay was more than earth. It was memory carried in the lines of her fingers. She rose and stepped out of the glow of the kiln, letting the night air cool her flushed cheeks. The yard opened up around her, a small clearing hemmed in by low mud brick walls and the soft sway of the palms. She walked to the edge of the yard, the worn dirt path, cool beneath her feet. Beyond it, the river gleamed silver and silent. Neferu closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the night, the scent of the river, the tang of wood smoke, the faint sweetness of wildflowers carried on the breeze. It all wrapped around her like a second blanket. She let herself lean into that quiet, that gentle breath of the earth. In this stillness, she felt the weight of the world ease off her shoulders. She thought of the stories her father told of the river, how it was born in lands she'd never seen far beyond the horizon, how it carried silt and secrets, how it fed the fields and the people year after year, how it never stopped moving even when the world above it slept. She liked to think the river's journey was like her own, slow, steady, patient, always moving forward even in the quiet of night. The moon was high now, its light soft and cool on her skin. She lifted her face to it, feeling its gentle glow. The stars whispered overhead, silent and watchful. She wondered what they saw, these ancient eyes in the dark. Did they remember the first pot her ancestors shaped, the first night her mother sang her to sleep by the kiln? Did they remember the quiet prayers of a girl alone in the night? She felt the echo of those questions in her chest, a soft ache, but not an unhappy one. It was the ache of belonging, of being part of something older and wiser than herself. She let that feeling settle into her bones, grounding her like the clay beneath her feet. She turned back to the kiln, the heart of her small world. Its light was a warm glow against the darkness, a promise of dawn yet to come. She fed it another log, careful and precise. The fire flared up, bright and fierce, then settled again into its soft hum. It was a living thing, this fire hungry, but generous if tended with care. She crouched by the kiln, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. She could almost hear it breathing a low, steady sigh. She pressed her hands to the rough bricks, feeling their warmth, their aid. These bricks had seen countless nights like this, countless hands tending them. They were part of her story, and she was part of theirs. She let her thoughts drift, weaving the threads of her memories into the quiet. She remembered the first pot she ever shaped, a small clumsy thing that wobbled and cracked. Her father had held it up to the light and smiled. "It's yours," he said, "and that's enough." She remembered the first time she tended the kiln alone, her hands trembling, her breath quick and uncertain. But the fire had steadied her, taught her the rhythm of patience and care. Each log, each breath was a promise to the craft that sustained her family. She remembered laughter, too. The way her father's eyes crinkled when he teased her about her smudged face, the way her mother's voice rose in song as she kneaded the clay. These were the treasures she carried into the night's small, bright things that warmed her when the world felt cold. In the flicker of the flames, she felt those memories wrap around her like a second skin. She was not alone. She was never alone. Not really. The kiln's breath, the river's song, the memory of hands that shaped and soothed, these were her companions in the darkness. She leaned back against the rough bricks, closing her eyes for a moment. The night stretched on, soft and deep. She let the fire's glow fill her mind, let it hush the restless thoughts that always seemed to stir when the world went quiet. She let herself believe just for this moment that everything she needed was here, warmth, memory breath. And in that quiet, she whispered a promise to the night. "I will keep this fire alive. I will remember." The kiln's test. Neferu's breath slowed with the rhythm of the fire, but her mind kept wandering. Tonight, the kiln was full a new batch of pots, each one shaped by her hands and carrying her hopes. She watched the flicker of flames that licked at the clay, the way the light painted the simple yard in soft orange and shadow. She could almost believe the fire was alive, speaking to her in its gentle crackle. She thought of the river again. By day it carried water and fish children's laughter, the quiet work of farmers at dawn. By night, it was a silver thread winding through the darkness, a promise of life in the dry land. The river was always moving, always giving. Like the kiln's heat, it asked nothing in return but care. Neferu shifted on the worn mat she kept by the kiln, her back against the low wall. She let her thoughts drift to the market square at dawn. She'd wake early, even before the sun cracked the horizon, to carry her fired pots down the narrow road to the market. Each step was measured, her baskets balanced carefully on her shoulders. She'd pause to catch her breath, to rest her feet, to watch the sky grow lighter. The market was always bustling vendors with baskets of dates and pomegranates, fishermen with their woven nets still damp, and the slow, steady shuffle of donkeys bearing water jars. The air smelled of baked bread and the sweet tang of figs. Neferu loved the chatter, the quiet gossip that wove through the crowd like a second breeze. She'd lay out her pots on a rough blanket, the sun catching their shapes, and wait for a kind word of fair trade. Those days felt like songs, small, steady notes of life that hummed beneath the bigger stories of pharaohs and palaces she'd never see. She didn't crave grandeur. She craved the simple weight of a day well lived. But tonight, she was here, rooted in the hush of her yard, watching the kiln's breath. She'd learned to read the kiln's moods, the sharp crack when the clay was too dry, the hiss of steam from a damp pot. She knew how to feed the fire just enough, how to coax it to steady heat without letting it rage out of control. She'd learned these things by watching, by listening. Her father had taught her that the kiln was a teacher, not a tool. It would test her shape, her patience, as surely as the clay took shape beneath her hands. She reached for a small jar of water, dipping her fingers in and tracing them along her forehead, a quiet blessing. Her mother used to say, water was the river's breath, that it carried the strength of the Nile. She believed it still. It was a ritual of sorts. Cool water on warm skin, a moment of pause in the heat of the fire. The night wore on. The stars turned overhead, quiet sentinels. Neferu felt the weight of them, the way they watched without judgment. She fed the kiln another handful of split logs, careful and deliberate. The flame flared warm and bright. It was easy to forget in that flicker of warmth that the kiln could also be a cruel master. She remembered the first time the kiln's breath turned against her. A small pot meant for a neighbor's wedding gift had cracked in the night. She'd woken to the sound-sharp final. The pot was ruined, its delicate lines shattered by heat and haste. She'd wept that night, not for the pot itself, but for the hope she'd poured into it. Her father had come his hands, rough and warm on her shoulders. The kiln teaches, he'd said, but it doesn't always speak kindly. She'd carried those words with her, tucked them into the quiet spaces of her heart. The kiln didn't forgive carelessness, but it rewarded patience. Each firing was a promise. If you listened, if you watched, if you breathed with the fire, it would carry your hopes safely to morning. Tonight she listened. The pots inside glowed softly, their shapes revealed and hidden by the flame. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease the small smile at the corner of her lips. There was comfort in this rhythm, the quiet crackle, the soft sigh of the river beyond the yard, the gentle glow of clay turning strong in the heart of the kiln. In the distance, a dog barked, once, then fell silent. The world felt held in a single breath, a pause between heartbeats. Neferu closed her eyes and let the night wrap around her. She didn't need grand stories of gods and kings. She had her own quiet empire here, Fireclay breath. It was enough. When she opened her eyes, the fire was still there, steady and bright. She reached out and traced her fingers along the warm bricks of the kiln. They were old, older than her memory, older than her mother's songs, but they were strong like the river, like the quiet beat of her own heart. She whispered a small prayer, not to any god she could name, but to the night itself. A promise of care, a promise of listening. And in the glow of the fire she felt that promise returned. You are enough. This night, this breath, this warmth, it is enough. The dawn's whisper. The fire had burned low by the time the first light of dawn reached the edge of the yard. The pale glow touched the rough stone of Neferu's small house, painting it in soft gold. She felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, the cool hush that comes when night finally gives way. Neferu pushed herself up from the mat, her legs stiff from the long vigil. She poured the last of the water over the kiln's coals, steam rising in a quiet sigh. The night had been gentle, but the kiln's work was never certain. She would not know if her pots had survived until she opened the kiln's belly, until the fire's secrets were revealed in the warm shapes of clay. She walked slowly to the edge of the yard, the dirt cool beneath her bare feet. The river was still a ribbon of silver in the soft dawn light, moving steadily past reeds that rustled in the breeze. She bent to touch the earth, tracing the lines left by the night's creatures, small paws, bird tracks, the faint drag of a beetle's shell. Even here, in this quiet corner of the world, life moved on. She thought of her mother's stories of how the river was the goddess's gift, a promise that the land would always remember its people. Neferu didn't speak of gods as easily as others did, but she believed in the river's gift. It was there in every handful of water she carried home, every pot that cooled in the dawn. She turned back to the kiln. The bricks were warm to the touch, the last of the heat seeping into the early morning air. She ran her fingers over the clay jar she kept by the kiln, an old piece, cracked and mended, but still whole. Her father had made it before she was born, and she kept it close as a promise that even the broken things can hold water again. Inside the house, the air was still cool, the scent of last night's fire lingering in the rafters. She found her small basket and filled it with barley bread, tough and dry, but enough to quiet the ache in her stomach. She chewed slowly, feeling the weight of the bread on her tongue, the simple comfort of it. She'd known hunger once, long lean days, when the river had run low, and the fields were cracked with heat. Her father had taught her that a full belly was not a promise but a blessing, a moment of peace to be savored. She still ate that way slowly, with care, as though each bite was a prayer for another day. Outside the village was stirring. She heard the bray of a donkey, the soft murmur of neighbors greeting the sun. She stepped into the yard and let the dawn wash over her, the light gentle on her face. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her hands moving with the ease of habit. Today would be like any other pots to carry words, to trade small kindnesses, to share. But she felt something in the air, a quiet promise that the river and the kiln had kept their secrets safe for another night. She lifted the lid of the kiln slowly, her breath catching as the warm air rushed out. The pots inside glowed faintly in the dawn light, their shapes smooth and strong. She reached in, cradling each one, in turn her fingers searching for cracks or flaws. But the fire had been kind. The clay had held. She stacked the pots carefully in the basket, the weight of them grounding her. Each one was a small testament to patience, to the quiet hours of the night. She thought of the market, of the slow shuffle of feet and the laughter of children. She thought of the old woman who bought her smallest bowls, the one who always smelled of rose water and baked dates. Neferu stepped out of the yard, the basket balanced on her hip. The road was still empty, the sun just a soft glow above the horizon. She walked slowly, her feet tracing the worn path through the fields. The earth was cool beneath the thin leather of her sandals, the air sweet with the promise of morning. She paused at the edge of the village, turning back to watch the smoke from her kiln drift into the sky. She felt a small smile at the corner of her lips, a warmth that went deeper than the fire's glow. It wasn't much, a handful of pots, a basket of bread, a quiet dawn, but it was enough. And as she stepped forward into the soft hush of morning, she carried that warmth with her, a promise that even in the smallest moments, there is light. The market's murmurs. The path to the village market was a winding one, lined with scrubby bushes and patches of wild grass. Neferu walked slowly, each step measured against the gentle rhythm of her breath. She could feel the cool earth beneath her feet, the way it gave slightly with each step, and the hush of the early morning wrapped around her like a soft blanket. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and baked bread, a promise of the life that waited in the small cluster of homes ahead. Neferu shifted the basket on her hip, the pots within it clinking softly, a sound she found oddly comforting, like the voice of the kiln itself. She passed the old fig tree that marked the edge of the village, its broad leaves already catching the first light of dawn. She paused there for a moment, resting her hand against the rough bark. Her father had once told her that fig trees were a sign of life's quiet endurance, rooted deep, reaching high. She liked that thought, especially on mornings like this. As she stepped into the market square, the sounds of the village began to rise around her. A child's laughter drifted from a doorway, the low murmur of neighbors greeting one another, the slap of sandals on packed earth. There was no rush here, no clamor, just the steady hum of life unfolding at its own gentle pace. She found her usual spot near the well, the place where the old woman with the rosewater scent liked to sit. She laid out her pots carefully on a rough blanket, arranging them in a small, neat circle. Each one was different. A little curve here, a faint thumbprint there, a testament to her patient nights by the kiln. Neferu watched the way the morning light caught the edges of her work, the soft glow of clay that had known the fire's breath. She ran her fingers lightly over the rim of a small jar, feeling the slight roughness where the glaze had pooled. There was comfort in that imperfection. It was real. It was hers. The market was quiet at first. People moved slowly, their voices low, as they exchanged greetings and shared the news of the night before. Neferu liked these early hours when the air was still cool and the day's weight hadn't yet settled into people's shoulders. A man selling dates caught her eye, his hands busy sorting the dark, sticky fruit into neat piles. He nodded to her, a soft smile on his lips. She remembered how he'd once given her a handful of dates when the kiln had eaten one of her best pots. A small kindness, but it had tasted sweeter than honey. A young mother paused at her blanket, her child tugging at her skirts. The woman ran her fingers over the smooth curve of a bowl, her eyes thoughtful. Neferu watched her silently, letting her take her time. The young mother finally chose a small jar, pressing a copper coin into Neferu's palm with a shy smile. Neferu thanked her softly, the weight of the coin a small, steady comfort. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep the kiln burning another night, to keep the barley bread on the table. She saw the old woman then moving slowly through the market with a basket balanced on her hip. Neferu felt a flicker of relief. She liked the way the old woman always paused, her eyes crinkling with warmth as she took in each new pot. Today she chose a small cup, its rim a little uneven, but its shape sturdy. The old woman held it in her hands for a long moment before looking up at Neferu. "You found the right clay this time," she said, her voice like the crackle of old leaves. "It holds the warmth a little longer, I think." Neferu smiled, a small, quiet pride blooming in her chest. She had learned to listen to the clay, to the way it whispered in her hands. She thanked the old woman, slipping the copper coins into her pouch with care. The sun rose higher, the market growing busier. Children chased each other in the dusty yard, their laughter a bright thread, woven through the hum of trade. Neferu watched them for a moment, remembering the way she used to run barefoot through these same streets, her mother's voice calling her home as the light faded. She felt a soft ache in her chest, sweet and sad, all at once. The village was changing. Children grew, old friends passed on, and yet the market's rhythm never faltered. It was a promise she clung to, as steady as the river's quiet song. As the morning stretched on, she sold a few more pots. A man with a crooked smile bought a water jug. A young girl chose a tiny bowl for her mother. Each trade was a moment, a small thread connecting her to the world around her. When the sun was high and the air thick with heat, Neferu packed up her remaining pots. She tied the blanket into a bundle, her hands moving with the easy familiarity of long practice. She paused at the well splashing cool water onto her face, feeling the grit of the market wash away. The road home was quiet. She walked slowly, her basket lighter, now her feet moving to the soft beat of her breath. She thought of the kiln waiting to be fed again tonight, of the pots she would shape with careful hands and patient heart, and she thought of the old woman's words that the right clay holds warmth a little longer. Neferu held that thought close like a secret promise, because in this quiet life, she had learned that warmth wasn't just heat. It was the steady glow of small kindnesses, the soft murmur of voices in the morning light. And she would carry that glow home with her tonight and every night to come. Ember and memory. The sun had begun its slow slide toward the horizon by the time Neferu reached the edge of her small yard. The air was still warm, but there was a softness in it now, the promise of evening's cool breath, whispering through the dust and scrub. She paused at the low wooden gate, her basket resting against her hip, and let her gaze drift across the little patch of earth she called home. The garden was dry, but green stubborn shoots of onion and lentil reaching for the last light. Her father's old hoe leaned against the fence, its handle worn smooth by years of use. She let her fingers brush against it as she passed a quiet nod to the man who had taught her to coax life from the soil. The small clay house waited for her, its door hanging slightly askew. She nudged it open with her shoulder, the familiar scent of smoke and baked earth rising to greet her. Inside the room was simple, a woven mat in the corner, a low table with a chipped jug of water, and the quiet hush of a space that had known many seasons of breath and memory. She set her basket down carefully, the few coins she had earned today tucked safely inside her pouch. The pots she had not sold, she lined up along the wall, each one a small testament to the patience of her hands. For a moment, she stood there, letting the hush of the room settle around her. The weight of the day fell away, like an old cloak, leaving only the soft pulse of her own heartbeat steady and low. She moved to the small hearth in the corner, where a few embers still glowed from the morning's cooking. She knelt, feeding the coals with a twist of dry grass, coaxing the flame back to life. The fire crackled softly, a gentle warmth that eased the ache in her shoulders. As the flames grew, she reached for the small clay cup the old woman had chosen that morning, turning it over in her hand. She thought of the old woman's eyes, the way they had crinkled with kindness, and of the quiet power of simple things, clay and water earth and fire. She poured a little water into the cup, taking a slow sip and letting the coolness wash over her tongue. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the water's journey through her body, a simple reminder of life's quiet constancy. The room was dim now, the only light, the glow of the small fire. Neferu sat by the hearth, her knees drawn up to her chest, and let her mind drift. She thought of the market, of the young mother's shy smile, the laughter of children, the way the sun had caught the edge of her pots and turned them to gold. She thought of the kiln waiting out back under the small lean-to. It was quiet now, but tonight she would feed it again, shape the clay with patient hands and gentle breath. She would watch the fire's dance, feel its heat against her skin, and let it teach her once more the old lesson that what is shaped in fire endures. She leaned back against the cool clay wall, the flickering firelight painting gentle shadows across her face. Outside, the wind sighed through the reeds, a lullaby for the earth, and those who listened closely enough to hear it. Neferu let herself listen to the hush of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the slow rhythm of her own breathing. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers in the first lessons of shaping clay. She thought of her mother's voice, low and warm humming songs to the night sky. In the quiet, she found them both again echoes of warmth and memory that wrapped around her like a soft blanket. She rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from her legs, and moved to the small doorway that looked out toward the kiln. The sky was deepening now, the first stars just beginning to blink awake in the soft twilight. She would tend the kiln tonight, she decided. She would shape the clay, feed the fire, and listen for the quiet secrets the flames had to share. Because in this small life of earth and heat and breath, she had learned the truth that mattered most, that even the humblest pot held the promise of warmth, and warmth was hope. She stepped outside the basket on her hip once more and walked into the night ready for the work ahead and for the quiet peace that would come after. A whisper in the coals. The night settled around Neferu's yard like a soft cloak. A sliver of moon rode high, its pale light painting silver across the dry earth and the weathered wood of her lean-to kiln. She stood a moment in the doorway, feeling the hush in the air, the kind of quiet that felt almost like a prayer. Her breath misted in the cool night. She gathered a handful of kindling her fingers, working by memory as she stacked the thin twigs in the heart of the kiln. Each piece a small promise of heat, each flicker of flame a chance to shape something enduring. She worked slowly, hands steady. The fire came to life with a sigh, low at first, then brighter. Shadows danced along the walls, and Neferu watched them sway the way her mother used to say they did when the gods were listening. She knelt close, feeding the kiln with care, and let the heat kiss her skin. There was a comfort in this warmth, in the crackle of kindling, and the glow that turned night's cold breath into something gentle. But tonight, something felt different. The old kiln had always been a friend, a quiet partner in her craft. Tonight, it felt almost watchful. The fire's hiss was like a whisper, and Neferu, weary and curious, leaned closer to listen. She thought she heard a low voice in the crackle, a memory of her father's laugh, perhaps, or the echo of her mother's lullabies. But it was only the flame's song, ancient and familiar, weaving stories from the wood and the clay. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The night was cold around her, but here in the glow of the kiln, she felt safe, strong, alive. Neferu worked the clay, with slow care shaping small cups and bowls, each curve guided by the breath of the fire. Her hands moved like water, smoothing and coaxing the form from the earth itself. She thought of the old woman's cup from earlier that day, how even the simplest vessel could hold comfort. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the reeds along the edge of the yard. The world beyond her gate was dark and wide, but here, in the circle of firelight, there was only the hum of life, the rhythm of her hands, the soft exhale of the kiln. Then a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow that wasn't hers, moving at the edge of the yard. Neferu paused, her breath caught in her throat. She peered into the darkness, heart thrumming like a drum in her chest. There, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, stood a man. He was wrapped in a rough wool cloak, a hood pulled low over his brow. His posture was still, but his presence was sharp, a blade honed by something she couldn't name. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady, though her heart quivered in her ribs. The man didn't speak. He watched her a moment longer, then stepped closer to the light. His face was warmed by the sun, dark eyes, glinting with something hard, something alive. "I mean no harm," he said softly. his voice low as the coals. I was passing by. Your fire. It called me. Neferu studied him. There was no weapon in his hands, no sign of threat, but there was a weariness in his stance and a hunger in his gaze that had nothing to do with food. It's only a kiln, she said, her fingers tightening on the edge of the work table. I'm just a potter. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the small bowls she was shaping. Even a potter's fire can warm more than clay. She didn't answer, but the truth of his words settled in the quiet between them. She had lived her life in the hush of small things, cups, bowls, simple vessels, but each one held the breath of the kiln, the echo of her hands. And maybe she thought even the smallest fire could offer solace to those lost in the dark. Neferu shifted, lifting a fresh bowl from the wheel. If you're cold, she said carefully, you may stand by the fire, but no closer. The man dipped his head in thanks, moving to the edge of the kiln's warmth. He didn't speak again, only watched as she shaped the clay, her fingers working in the rhythm of breath and earth. In the glow of the flames, they were two figures alone, each with their own quiet shadows, each warmed by the same small blaze. And though Neferu said nothing more, she felt the weight of the night shift, the cold driven back by the kiln's soft roar and the shared hush of those who have known hard roads. She worked through the night, the stranger silent at the edge of the light, and in the flicker of the flames, she found a kind of peace she hadn't known she was missing. Because even in the cold, even in the dark, there was warmth to be found, if only in the quiet hum of fire and breath. And sometimes that was enough. The stranger's shadow, the night stretched on the kiln's glow, steady as a heartbeat. Neferu worked by its light, her hands moving with a quiet rhythm, shaping the clay into humble vessels of promise. The stranger stood a little way off, wrapped in his wool cloak, eyes reflecting the fire's flicker. His silence was not empty. It was a hush that felt almost patient, as if he understood the way the night held its breath around the small glow of her world. She didn't speak much. Words felt too large, too heavy, and the stranger didn't press for them. Instead, he watched. He watched the way her fingers coaxed the clay, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. In the hush of the kiln's heat, there was a strange kind of honesty, no titles, no masks, just the simple truth of breath and earth. When she paused to rest her hands, Neferu glanced at him. You've walked a long road, she said quietly, not a question, but an observation. The lines in his face, the dust on his boots, she saw the miles in them. He nodded once. I have, he said softly. The world is wide, but sometimes even the smallest fire can guide you home, if only for a moment. Neferu let the words settle between them like the coals in the kiln. She had never thought of her fire as a beacon, just a necessity, a tool for survival. But tonight, in the stranger's low voice, it sounded like something more. She reached for a small jug of water, offering it with a careful hand. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. They were rough and warm, a traveler's hands marked by work and weather. Thank you, he murmured. He drank slow and measured, as if the water itself was a kindness he had almost forgotten. Do you have a name? Neferu asked, her voice a hush beneath the crackle of the kiln. The stranger hesitated, then gave her a small, wry smile. Call me Darius, he said. I've worn many names, but tonight, that one will do. Darius, she echoed. And what brings you to my fire? Darius. My pots are humble. My hearth is small. His eyes held a flicker of something, sorrow perhaps, or memory. It's not the size of the fire that matters, he said. It's the warmth it offers, the light it keeps. She studied him, this man who spoke in the careful tones of someone who knew too well the cost of words. She wondered what he carried in the shadow of that cloak, what burdens, what regrets. But she didn't ask. She only nodded, turning back to her work because sometimes the weight of a question is more than a man can bear. The kiln's breath filled the night, the heat pressing gentle against her skin. Neferu shaped another bowl of the clay, soft beneath her hands, her movements sure and slow. She thought of her father long gone now, and how he used to say that every pot held a piece of the potter's soul. Maybe that was true. Maybe that was why the stranger had paused at her gate. As she worked, Darius moved a little closer, drawn by the glow. He said nothing more, but she could feel his gaze steady and watchful, not demanding, not invasive, just present. In the quiet, Neferu found herself remembering the old stories her mother used to tell by the hearth. Tales of travelers and guardians of those who walked the night roads, carrying warmth from one small fire to the next. She had thought them only bedtime fancies meant to lull a child to sleep. But tonight, with the kiln's glow in her eyes and a stranger in her yard, she wondered if maybe those stories had always been a little bit true. The hours slipped by the fire, burning low and patient. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the hush of the world wrapped around them like a soft blanket. At last, Neferu set aside her tools, wiping her hands on a scrap of cloth. She looked at the man who had become a quiet part of her night. "Will you stay until dawn?" she asked softly, her voice little more than a breath. Darius looked past her into the dancing shadows of the kiln. "I'll stay as long as the fire burns," he said. "And then I'll see where the road leads next." Neferu nodded. In that simple exchange, there was a promise. Not of forever, but of this one night, this one hush of warmth in the cold darkness. She fed the last scraps of kindling to the coals, watching the flames catch and flicker. The kiln glowed like a small sun in the heart of the yard, and the stranger's shadow danced at its edge. And Neferu Potter daughter, keeper of quiet fires, felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't known she was missing. Not love, not yet, but the soft echo of it, waiting in the hush of breath and clay, the kiln's secret. The kiln's light was beginning to fade its coals, a slow breath in the darkness. Neferu sat near its mouth, the last of her pots cooling on a simple wooden board. The night air held a chill, the hush of the yard, wrapping around her shoulders like a threadbare blanket. She glanced at Darius, who remained by the edge of the yard, his silhouette cut from the shadows. There was something about him, something in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes traced the glow of the coals that told her he was not merely passing through. He was a man weighed down by stories he hadn't spoken, memories he hadn't yet buried. She felt it in the way he watched the kiln, as if the fire's breath was speaking to a part of him he kept hidden. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world had settled into a kind of truce, her clay pots lined up like humble sentinels, the wind gentled to a whisper, and the stranger's quiet presence a question she hadn't decided how to answer. At last, she broke the silence. "This kiln," she said softly, "it was my father's. He taught me how to coax life from earth and water. He said every pot carried a memory, a piece of the soul that shaped it." Darius tilted his head, his gaze flickering to her hands. "And what memory do you shape tonight?" he asked, his voice low, touched by something she couldn't name. She hesitated. The question felt larger than she was ready for. "I don't know," she said, honestly. "Maybe A promise, or a prayer, or just the quiet comfort of knowing something endures the heat. He nodded, his eyes soft. That's no small thing, to shape hope from earth. The words settled over her like a gentle weight, and she realized she was grateful for them. In a world that often took more than it gave, there was comfort in hearing someone speak of hope as if it mattered. She gestured to a small pot beside her, its curve simple and unadorned. This one, she said, was the hardest to shape. The clay kept cracking, but I kept working it, smoothing it back together. I wanted it to hold water, even if it never held wine. Darius reached out, then his fingertips brushing the rim of the pot. He didn't lift it, just touched it, as if to feel the heat still caught in the clay. Sometimes the ones that break the most hold the deepest purpose, he said almost to himself. She watched him, a flicker of curiosity warming her chest. What about you? She asked softly. What do you carry tonight? His shoulders tightened, a brief shadow across his face. He pulled his hand back, folding it into the folds of his cloak. Memories, he said, a name that's not mine anymore, and the weight of a choice I'm still learning how to bear. She didn't press him. The night was too gentle for confessions forced from reluctant lips. But in that small admission, she saw the crack in his armor, the first hint of the man beneath the traveler's cloak. The kiln hissed softly a final sigh as its coals settled. She leaned closer, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. You're welcome to share this fire as long as it burns, she said. No questions, no debts. Darius looked at her then, and there was something raw in his gaze, something that flickered like the kiln's last light. That may be the kindest thing I've heard in a long time, he said. She offered him a small smile, one that felt fragile but real. Kindness costs nothing, she said simply. And in the cold, it's worth everything. For a while they sat in that hush, the quiet crackle of the dying fire, the only sound between them. The yard felt like a world unto itself, small safe, wrapped in the gentle glow of shared warmth. Neferu thought of her father, of the nights they spent by the kiln when she was a child. She remembered the way he used to hum under his breath, a tune older than memory as he shaped the clay. And she wondered if even in this stranger's company, she could still hear that melody, soft and steady, like a promise. The moon slipped higher, silvering the rough edges of the yard. Neferu rose at last, brushing the clay from her skirts. I'll bring another log for the fire, she said. Stay, if you like. Or go. But the warmth is yours if you want it. He said nothing as she turned to fetch the wood. But when she returned, she found him closer to the kiln, his cloak drawn tight around his shoulders. The weight of the night was in his eyes, but so was the glimmer of something else, something that might have been hope. She fed the coals, another breath of wood, and the flame caught again a quiet blaze in the darkness. As the fire rose, Neferu felt the hush of the yard settle deeper, the stranger's presence, a gentle gravity that pulled her heart in ways she didn't yet understand. The first glimpse of dawn. The night air clung to the yard thick with the scent of clay and cooling ash. The fire in the kiln had burned low, a hush of red embers that pulsed like the last heartbeats of a song. Neferu sat beside it, her fingers still dusted with earth, her eyes drawn to the quiet man whose name she did not yet know. Darius had stayed, though he had no reason to. He lingered, in the soft hush of the yard, his gaze fixed on the slow dance of the coals, as if they alone could show him something he had been searching for. The first edge of dawn began to lift the darkness. A pale light touched the yard's rough stones, casting long, slender shadows that seemed to stretch from one lifetime into another. Neferu rose and reached for the battered kettle she kept near the kiln. "I'll heat some water," she said softly. "It's not much, but it's warm." He nodded, his voice still a stranger's whisper. "Warmth is enough," he said. She set the kettle over the faint coals, listening to the slow hiss as water met heat. Her mind wandered to the days when the kiln's glow had been the only light in her world, the only certainty she had known. She thought of her father's rough hands guiding hers, the hush of his breath as he taught her how to turn earth into promise. Darius watched her work, his brow furrowed in thought. At last he spoke the words, careful. "Why do you stay," he asked, "in this place, with nothing but clay and fire?" She paused, her hand resting on the kettle's handle. "Because it's mine," she said simply. "Because even the smallest flame can hold a world's worth of hope if you let it." He considered that the faintest of smiles in his eyes. And what of the world beyond these walls? She shrugged, the motion gentle. "It's there," she said. "But out there, everything is noise. Here it's just the quiet breath of the earth. And that's enough for me." The kettle began to murmur, small bubbles rising to the surface. She poured the water into 2 chipped clay cups, the steam curling like soft ghosts in the dawn light. She handed him one, their fingers brushing for a moment, a fleeting touch, but one that seemed to echo in the hush. He accepted the cup with a small nod. "Thank you," he said. She settled back beside the kiln, her hands wrapped around her own cup. The water was plain, but the warmth seeped through the clay, a small comfort that reached into her bones. For a time, they sat in the quiet, the world around them still soft with sleep. She found her gaze drawn to the faint scar along his jaw, the way it caught the first threads of light. She wondered what story it told, what night of violence or sorrow had left its mark. "You've seen much," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a truth that needed no answer. His shoulders shifted the smallest of movements. "I have," he admitted. "Too much, maybe. And yet you're here," she said, her voice a murmur. A long pause. Then he looked at her, his eyes calm and searching. "I'm here because the world outside these walls, it's loud and it's cold. But here there's warmth. And for tonight, that's enough." The words settled between them like a promise unspoken but understood. In that moment, the yard felt like a sanctuary, fragile, perhaps, but real. Neferu took a slow sip of her water, feeling the dawn creep across her skin. She thought of her father's old saying that the kiln's breath was a kind of prayer, and she wondered if in this quiet yard she was learning how to pray again, how to shape something gentle from the roughness of the world. She glanced at the pots cooling on the boards, their shapes plain but sturdy. Each one a small testament to patience, to the belief that even clay can hold a story worth telling. And in the stranger's quiet presence, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared name, something like trust, like the first glimmer of dawn in the darkness. The kettle had gone silent, the coals beneath it sighing in relief. She rose and poured the last of the water into the yard, a small offering to the earth that had given her everything. When she turned back, Darius was watching her, his eyes soft in the dawn light. "Will you tell me your name?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, then nodded. "Neferu," she said. "My name is Neferu." He held her gaze for a long moment, then offered a small smile. "Neferu," he repeated, as if tasting the shape of it on his tongue. A name worth remembering. The dawn had fully arrived now, the sky a pale wash of color. The kiln's coals glowed faint and weary, but the yard felt warm, still held together by the quiet breath of two souls who had chosen for this moment, at least, to share the same fragile warmth, the weight of small choices. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, turning the yard's shadows long and gold, Neferu and Darius busied themselves with the next small tasks of the day. There was no rush, only the quiet urgency of tending to things that mattered no more, no less. Neferu showed him how to sweep the ash from the kiln's mouth, careful not to scatter it across the cooling pots. The ash tells its own story. She murmured, her voice low, as if sharing a secret with the wind. It shows you the heart of the fire, what was taken, what was given. Darius watched the fine white powder sift through her fingers. Does it ever feel endless? He asked quietly. The work, the waiting. She paused, the wooden broom in her hand stilled. Some days, she admitted, her eyes meeting his. But even the smallest chores hold their own kind of grace. Each stroke of the broom, each breath, it's a chance to begin again. He nodded, his gaze distant. Maybe that's what I have been looking for, he said softly. A place where starting over isn't just survival, where it's a kind of healing. Neferu didn't press him. She simply turned back to the kiln, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with her own silences long ago. As the shadows grew deeper, they moved together through the small rituals of the evening, gathering the chipped pots that wouldn't make it to market, stacking the good ones in neat rows, folding the damp cloths that had covered the clay. These small acts were like the heartbeat of the yard, steady, humble, and necessary. Later, as twilight settled, they sat on the low wall by the edge of the yard. Neferu poured them each a cup of weak beer, the kind she brewed from barley and honey. It was thin, but it warmed the throat and loosened the knots in the mind. For a while, they sat in an easy hush, listening to the evening songs of birds, nesting in the reeds beyond the fence. Darius leaned back against the wall, his long legs stretched out, his face turned toward the pale light of the setting sun. You know, he said after a moment, in all the places I've wandered, I never found a spot that felt like it belonged to me, or maybe that I belonged to. She looked at him, the gentle lines of his face softened by the dusk. Maybe belonging isn't about a place, she said. Maybe it's about how you choose to stand in it, how you choose to stay. He considered that, his eyes searching hers for something that only he could name. Then he nodded, a small, slow gesture. That's a kind of comfort I've never known, he said, but it feels honest. Neferu smiled faintly, though her eyes were thoughtful. It is, she said. This yard, this kiln, it's not much, but it's enough for me, because every day I stand here, I choose to make it mine. A breeze stirred the air, cool and sweet with the promise of night. They sipped their beer in companionable quiet, the last of the sun slipping behind the low hills. The flicker of the kiln's banked coals glowed softly like a small heartbeat in the deepening dark. Do you ever think, Darius said after a long pause, that the real weight of life isn't in the big choices but in the small ones? Like whether to stay or to go, whether to sweep the floor or let it lie. She turned her head, the last glimmer of daylight catching in her eyes. I think, she said softly, that the small choices are the only ones that matter, because they're the ones we make every day. He let out a long, slow breath, as if some tightness in his chest had finally begun to ease. I think you're right, he said, and I think maybe I'm ready to start choosing. In the hush that followed, Neferu felt the faint glow of possibility, a tiny, stubborn light, flickering in the long dusk. She didn't know if he would stay, or if the road would call him away again. But for tonight, at least, they shared this quiet corner of the world. And in that sharing, there was a kind of warmth no kiln could forge, a warmth born of small kindnesses and the courage to begin again. The promise of the hearth. The next morning arrived with a hush of soft blue light, the kind that seeps in slow and patient through the cracks of wooden shutters. Neferu was already awake, her movements quiet and deliberate as she stoked the banked coals in the hearth. She hummed softly under her breath, an old song of her mother's that spoke of rivers and homecomings. Darius lay on the small straw mat she'd offered him the night before. He woke to the scent of barley bread toasting over the embers, the faint, sweet tang of honeyed beer warming in a clay jug. The aches of travel still clung to his bones, but he found a curious lightness in his chest, a fragile but welcome peace. "You slept well?" Neferu asked, her voice low but kind, as she turned the bread with careful hands. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his limbs, but also a slow smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "Better than I have in years," he said. "It's quieter here." She nodded, her dark eyes flicking to the coals. "Quiet is where we mend," she said, "where we remember how to breathe." As they shared the morning meal, Darius watched the simple rhythms of the yard unfold. A neighbor's rooster crowed from beyond the low stone wall. The wind stirred the pale linen cloth that covered the pots. The world outside still waited with its endless demands, but here there was only the warmth of bread, the small kindness of shared silence. Neferu poured him a cup of the sweet beer. "You'll be going soon, I suppose," she said quietly, her tone neither hopeful nor resigned, only matter of fact. He paused, the cup warm in his hand. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe not just yet." She met his eyes, searching for some deeper current beneath his simple words. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently. "The kiln teaches us that one firing at a time, one breath at a time." He nodded, grateful for her patience, for the way she let his silences stand without pressing them into shape. "I've spent so long running," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "It's hard to remember how to stay." Neferu didn't offer easy answers. Instead, she rose and moved to the kiln's side, her fingers tracing the rough curve of its mouth. "Then stand here," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "Just for today. Just long enough to feel the warmth and know it's real." He watched her, the flicker of the coals casting her face in soft shadows. There was no judgment in her gaze, no demand, only the quiet certainty of someone who had chosen this life, its small comforts, its steady work, and found it enough. For the rest of the morning they moved together in the gentle hush of the yard. Darius learned how to patch a cracked pot with river clay, how to listen for the faint hum of the kiln as it woke to life. Each small task was a promise of care, of attention, of belonging in a world that rarely offered it freely. At midday, they sat beneath the fig tree by the low fence, sharing the last of the bread and the sweetness of sun-warmed fruit. The breeze was soft, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the tang of distant salt air. "Do you ever think," Darius said, breaking the soft hush, "that the fire is more than just heat? That it's something else too?" Neferu tilted her head, thoughtful. "The fire is a promise," she said. "It's the heart of this place. It asks only that we feed it, tend it, and in return, it keeps us warm, even on the coldest nights." He closed his eyes, breathing in the warmth of the sun on his face, the quiet hum of the kiln behind them. "A promise," he repeated. "I think I could learn to trust that." For a long while, They let the quiet hold them, each of them, rooted in this small moment of peace. And though the road beyond the fence still called his name, Darius felt something shift in the hollow of his chest, a flicker of hope, small but stubborn as a seed in dark earth. When the sun began its slow, honey-colored slide down the sky, he rose and looked to Neferu, his voice low and sure. "I'll stay one more night," he said. "One more night to see how the fire lives." She nodded, her smile gentle but bright. "Then we'll tend it together," she said, "and in the tending, we'll find the warmth we've both been chasing." And in that soft, flickering hush, the day drifted on. Two souls, learning to stand still side by side in the quiet promise of the hearth. The clay's secret. That night, the stars emerged like shy lanterns scattered across the velvet sky. The kiln glowed softly, its breath a warm hush in the yard. Darius sat close by, watching the flicker of coals, mesmerized by the dance of heat and shadow. Neferu worked steadily. Her hands moved with a calm precision, turning a lump of river clay on the small wheel she'd set up under the fig tree. She spoke softly as she shaped the clay, the words, drifting like smoke into the night. "This earth, it has memory," she said. "Every piece of clay remembers the river that carried it, the hands that shaped it. That's why we listen before we mold it into what it will be." Darius watched her, the slow turning of the wheel, the gentle pressure of her palms. "I never thought of it that way," he murmured. "I always thought you forced the clay to obey." She smiled faintly. "No, Darius, the clay doesn't obey. It yields, yes, but only if you're patient enough to hear its song." He leaned closer, drawn by her quiet intensity. "And what if it cracks? What if it can't hold the shape? Then you start again," she said simply, "but you never rush. The cracks show you where the clay is weakest. You learn and you mend. That's the craft and the life." For a long moment, the night was only the turning of the wheel, the hush of breath, and the song of the fire. Darius felt a hush settle over him, a kind of listening he hadn't known he was capable of. He realized he'd spent years fighting the world, forcing himself into shapes that never quite fit. Watching Neferu's gentle touch, he saw another way, one that asked not for conquest, but for care. As she worked, she told him stories of her childhood, of her father, a potter who taught her the patient art of listening, of her mother who sang songs to the kiln so the fire would bless each piece. The stories wove around them like a warm blanket, softening the sharp edges of Darius's restless spirit. "You said the clay remembers," he said finally. "Do you think people do too? Even if they've been broken?" Neferu's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was only the fire between them. "Yes," she said softly. "People remember. Even the broken pieces carry the story. Sometimes. That's what makes them most beautiful." He let her words settle in the quiet of his chest, feeling them root there. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to move on, to run from the echoes of his past. Here by the glow of the kiln and the softness of Neferu's voice, he felt something tender bloom of fragile trust in the healing of patient hands. The night deepened, and together they tended the kiln, feeding it small sticks of olive wood and dried reeds. Each crackle of flame was a promise, each curl of smoke a whisper of possibility. Darius found himself laughing softly as Neferu teased him about his clumsy hands, his unpracticed touch. But there was no mockery, only the gentle warmth of shared work. When the last of the clay pots was set by the fire to cure, they sat side by side in the hush of the yard. The stars turned slowly overhead, and the world felt soft and forgiving. Neferu leaned her head back against the rough trunk of the fig tree. The kiln will rest now, she said, and tomorrow we'll see what the fire has taught us. Darius nodded, feeling the slow, sure rhythm of her words settle into the hollow spaces inside him. Tomorrow, he echoed, and tonight, I'll listen. The night closed around them quiet and gentle, and in that soft darkness, the promise of clay and fire wove a new thread into Darius's heart, a thread of patience, of warmth, of belonging in a world that no longer needed to be conquered, only tended. The potter's light. Dawn found the yard wrapped in the pale glow of first light, soft and cool as a sigh. The kiln had quieted in the night, its final embers now, a hush of warmth beneath the clay shell. Darius woke to the scent of the earth, the faint tang of ash and sweet bread baking in the small clay oven Neferu kept near the porch. She was already up her hands, dusted with flour and clay. He watched her for a moment, the way her fingers moved, with careful grace, like she was shaping not just bread, but the very breath of the morning. "You rise early," he said quietly, stepping into the gentle hush of the yard. Neferu glanced up with a small smile. "The fire rests, but the day waits," she said, "and there is always work that calls to gentle hands." He moved closer, the chill of dawn fading in the glow of her presence. "I never knew work could feel so calm," he murmured. "In the city, everything is hurry, noise, no time to listen." Neferu nodded, tearing a small piece of dough and shaping it into a round loaf. "The city chases what it cannot hold," she said softly. "Here we let the day come as it will, and we find the rhythm in each breath." They shared a simple meal in the pale light bread, warm from the oven, soft cheese, sweet figs. There was no need for hurry, no rush to the next moment. Each bite was a pause, a chance to taste the morning's quiet promise. Afterward, Neferu led him to the kiln. She brushed the soot gently from the new pots, her eyes bright with the quiet pride of a craft well tended. "Each piece holds a bit of the fire's breath," she said. "A bit of the river's memory, too." Darius traced the smooth curve of a small cup she offered him. "It's beautiful," he said softly, "like it was always meant to be." She looked at him, her gaze steady but kind. "Nothing is ever perfect, Darius, but in the flaws there's a kind of truth, a story that no smooth surface can hold." For a moment, he let her words wash over him, feeling the weight of them settle into the hollow places in his chest. "You make it sound so simple," he said, "but it's not, is it?" Neferu's smile was soft but wry. "Simple doesn't mean easy," she said. "It means honest. The fire, the clay, the quiet, all of them ask us to listen, to wait. And in the waiting, we find what matters." They worked side by side through the morning, Darius clumsy, but eager to learn. Neferu taught him how to smooth the wet clay, how to feel its weight and balance. She guided his hands with patient care, each touch a silent invitation to trust the shape of the moment. "You don't have to force it," she said as his fingers faltered. "Let it guide you. Clay remembers, but so do you. Let your hands remember too." By midday, they paused beneath the fig tree. The sun was warm now, the yard filled with the scent of earth and green leaves. Darius looked around at the small space that had already begun to feel like a quiet refuge, a soft place to land after too many years of running. "Neferu," he said slowly, "why do you stay here, so far from the city, from everything the world calls important?" She tilted her head, her dark hair catching the sun. "Because the world doesn't get to decide what's important," she said. "This place, This work, it's enough for me. And maybe it can be enough for you too. He looked at her, at the kiln still warm from the night's fire, at the gentle curve of her smile. And for the first time, he let himself believe that it might be true. In that hush of sun and earth, Darius felt a small, quiet truth settle in his heart, that the simplest warmth, a loaf of bread, a shared silence, could be the most important thing in the world. And so they let the day drift on each moment, a slow breath, each heartbeat, a promise that the clay's memory was also their own. The weight of a promise. The afternoon light drifted through the yard, soft and honey-colored. Neferu and Darius sat beneath the fig tree, the silence between them thick with quiet questions. Darius ran his fingers along the smooth rim of a new cup, feeling the faint imperfections in the clay. "You make it look so easy," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "like you've always known what you're doing." Neferu shook her head slowly, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. "No one knows at first," she said gently. "We all begin with clumsy hands and restless hearts. But if we're patient, the clay teaches us." He looked at her the way the sun traced gold into her dark hair, the soft way she spoke each word. "And if we're not patient?" he asked quietly. She paused, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the kiln's memory. "Then the clay breaks," she said simply, "or it never finds the shape it was meant to hold." Darius let her words settle, feeling them like the weight of a promise he wasn't sure he was ready to make. He thought of the years he'd spent running from one city to the next, never stopping long enough to let anything take root. "But what if I don't know how to stay?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Neferu reached out her fingers, brushing his hand warm and sure. "Then let the clay teach you," she said. "One breath at a time, one shape at a time." For a moment, there was only the soft sigh of the wind in the fig leaves, the hush of birds settling for the evening. Darius felt the truth of her words settle deep in his chest, warm as the kiln's glow. They worked together through the last light of day, shaping small bowls and cups, each one a quiet testament to patience and presence. Neferu showed him how to mend a crack, with slip a thin wash of clay that sealed the break. "It doesn't erase the scar," she said, her voice calm and certain, "but it makes it part of the story." As they worked, Darius found himself remembering other scars hidden in the quiet corners of his heart. He wondered if they too could be mended by hands that knew how to listen. When the sun slipped behind the hills, Neferu rose and lit the small oil lamp that hung by the door. Its light was soft, a gentle glow that filled the yard with the hush of possibility. "You don't have to decide tonight," she said, her voice a soft hush in the dusk. "The fire will wait. The clay will wait. And so will I." He looked at her, the warmth in her eyes, the quiet promise in her steady breath. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to flee from what he saw. That night, as he lay on the simple straw mat by the kiln, he let the silence fill him like the breath of the earth. The ache of the past was still there, but softer now, like a crack, mended with slip, no longer a weakness, but a part of the shape he was learning to hold. The kiln's whisper. The night air held a gentle chill, weaving through the yard and over the quiet shapes of the clay bowls and cups they'd finished that day. Darius lay awake, listening to the hush of the kiln, its slow exhale of warmth and memory. Neferu's words drifted through his mind, simple truths that felt heavier than any city's noise. The clay will wait, and so will I. He thought of the years he'd spent chasing shadows, running from voices, from memories, from the simple ache of wanting to belong. Here in this quiet yard beneath a sky dusted with stars, he found no need to run. He rose in the hush before dawn, the earth cool beneath his bare feet. The kiln glowed softly, a heartbeat of embers. He could almost hear its gentle whisper. Stay. Neferu was already awake, a soft silhouette by the kiln's glow. She looked up as he approached, her expression open and kind. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. Didn't want to. He admitted, his voice low. I didn't want to miss this. This quiet. She nodded her hands, cradling a small clay bowl, the curve of it smooth and unfinished. Then come, she said. Help me shape the day. They worked side by side, the hush of morning folding around them like a soft blanket. Neferu showed him how to center the clay on the wheel, how to let it guide his fingers. He found a rhythm in the turning, the slow dance of earth and water. It's never just about the clay, she murmured, her breath warm against the dawn chill. It's about listening, about letting go of what you think you know. He watched the cup take shape beneath his hands, imperfect, but steady. Each breath felt like a choice, each touch a promise that he could stay. As the sun rose, turning the yard to gold, Neferu dipped her hands in the slip, mending the small cracks in the clay. She glanced at him, her dark eyes bright, with something that looked like hope. You're learning, she said softly. I'm trying, he replied. It feels honest, like the first real thing I've done in years. She smiled, a quiet curve of lips that felt like sunrise. That's all any of us can do. Try, listen, mend what's broken. The rest of the day unfolded in soft, steady motions. Bread baking in the small oven, warm cheese and olives shared in the hush of the noon sun. Darius felt the weight of the city slip from his shoulders, replaced by the gentle ache of belonging. As twilight settled, he stood by the kiln, the heat of it, warm against the night's chill. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, of the darkness he'd carried, of the empty rooms he'd left behind. Neferu joined him, her hand brushing against his in a quiet promise. Tomorrow, she said softly, we fire the kiln again. We give the clay its final shape. He looked at her, the soft strength in her gaze, the way her breath seemed to weave into the hush of the night. And after that, he asked, his voice low and steady. She tilted her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. After that, we see what shape the day takes, one breath at a time. He nodded, feeling the quiet certainty of her words settle into the hollow spaces of his heart. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to run. For the first time, he felt the kiln's hush as an invitation not to flee, but to stay. The last firing. The dawn broke soft and pale light, brushing the yard with a promise of warmth. Darius woke to the low hum of the kiln, its breath deep and steady, a quiet song that had carried him through so many restless nights. Today was the final firing. The day when the clay would find its shape, fragile, flawed, and forever. He stepped into the yard, the air cool against his skin. Neferu was already there, her hands busy with the small, careful tasks that marked the beginning of something new, tending the coals, checking the stacked vessels, touching each one as though they held not just earth, but memory. You slept well? She asked, her voice gentle as the hush of the dawn. I did, he said, and meant it. He felt the quiet of the night still in his bones, a peace he hadn't known he'd been searching for. They worked in silence, hands moving in soft rhythm. The kiln's mouth yawned wide, and they fed it with small logs, the sweet smoke of olive wood curling into the brightening sky. Neferu showed him how to watch the color of the flame, how to hear the kiln's voice in the crackle of wood and the hush of embers. It's not just fire, she said softly. It's the breath of the earth, shaping the clay's final song. He watched the kiln glow brighter, felt the soft heat on his face. The air was thick with the scent of warm earth and sweet smoke, a memory he knew he'd carried long after the kiln's breath had quieted. As the sun climbed higher, they shared small pieces of bread and olives, the simple meal soft on the tongue. Neferu's laughter was low and easy, a quiet music that wove through the heat and the hush. You've come a long way, she said, her eyes bright. The first day you arrived, I thought you'd vanish before the dawn. I almost did. He admitted, a smile tugging at his lips. But then I saw the way you listen to the clay, the way you make space for every small breath. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. And now, he paused, feeling the words like the slow turn of the wheel, steady and true. Now I think I want to stay. The kiln's heat rose, a soft roar that filled the yard. Darius closed his eyes and let the warmth wash over him, the quiet of it steady and sure. He thought of all the places he'd fled, the nights spent listening for footsteps in the dark. Here there was only the hush of fire and the slow, patient breath of earth. As the sun began to slip behind the hills, Neferu opened the kiln's mouth, revealing the vessels they had shaped together. The clay was no longer soft, no longer waiting. It was strong now and warm and alive, with the memory of hands and breath. They set the pieces out to cool the gentle hush of evening, folding around them. Darius traced the rim of a cup, felt the faint marks of their making, a quiet testament to the simple act of staying. Neferu turned to him, her smile soft as the hush of the twilight. It's not just about the clay, she said. It's about finding a place to belong, about letting the fire shape you and trusting that even in the heat, you won't break. He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest like the slow beat of the kiln's breath. In this quiet yard beneath the slow arc of the stars, he had found something he hadn't known. He needed a place to rest, a place to begin. The night fell soft and gentle, the last hush of the fire mingling with the rustle of fig leaves. Darius looked at Neferu, the warmth of her gaze, the steady rise and fall of her breath. And he knew that even as the clay cooled, the warmth of it would linger soft and steady as the hush of the kiln, as the quiet promise of a home. The night settles in slow and sure, like a soft blanket drawn across the yard. The kiln's glow has faded to embers, but the warmth lingers, a quiet reminder that even the smallest fire can outlast the cold. Darius sits on the worn bench, the air around him carrying the gentle hush of a world finally at peace. He thinks of the years he spent running the nights when every footstep was a question and every breath a prayer. In this quiet, he finds a truth so simple it nearly breaks his heart, that the only real warmth is the one you make with your own hands, shared in the hush of the night. Neferu's voice echoes softly her laughter, a memory that dances between the fig leaves. She showed him that even in the hardest days, there is kindness, that every bowl of bread, every cup of water carries a story worth telling. He remembers how she looked at him steady sure when he was still learning how to listen to the clay, how to let it shape him in return. He remembers how her touch was never hurried, how her words were always enough. And he knows now that the measure of a life isn't the battles you fight, but the gentleness you choose to carry forward. The yard is still save for the soft murmur of the night. The air tastes of wood smoke and sweet herbs, and Darius can almost hear the breath of the earth itself, a quiet promise that tomorrow will come and it will be enough. He thinks of the city of the noise and the shadows he left behind. He thinks of the long roads that brought him here, each mile a test of will, each sunrise a small victory. And he wonders if maybe the real strength isn't in fighting, but in staying, in choosing to stand still when every part of you wants to flee. The clay cups he shaped today sit in a neat row by the kiln, each one a quiet testament to his journey. They are not perfect. They are not meant to be. The little cracks, the uneven rims speak of a human hand of mistakes and learning of a heart that refused to close. And in their imperfection, he finds something that feels like truth, like forgiveness, like home. He closes his eyes and breathes in the night. The air is cool, but his heart is warm. He knows that he will rise tomorrow and feed the fire again, that he will shape the clay with care, let it teach him the slow patience of belonging. And he knows that even when the night is at its darkest, there is light, soft, flickering, but real. Darius thinks of the lessons he learned here, of how loyalty is not just to others, but to the quiet voice inside that says, stay. Of how courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving even when your feet ache and your back is bent. Of how the truth is never loud, never cruel. It is a whisper, a breath, a hand resting steady on your shoulder. These are the gifts he will carry long after the kiln's breath has gone silent. He hopes that those who listen tonight, wherever you are on your porch, swing by the soft glow of a lamp, wrapped in the hush of your own memories, you hear this too, that you feel the gentle pulse of this story weaving through the quiet of your room, that you know in your bones that you are not alone. We all have our nights of fear, our days of doubt. We all carry the weight of old wounds and the ache of what could have been. But we also carry the warmth of shared breath, of small kindnesses of a cup passed from hand to hand in the hush of the night. To those of you listening with silver in your hair and the weight of years in your heart, know this: your story matters. Your memories, your quiet joys, and your fierce hopes are the foundation of everything that endures. In a world that moves too fast, your slow breath is a steady song, a reminder that time is not the enemy, but a gentle teacher. So let this tale be a soft place to rest tonight. Let it be a warm fire in the darkness, a quiet echo of every kindness you've ever given. Close your eyes and let the hush of the night hold you. Remember that you have shaped more than clay in your life. You have shaped laughter and comfort, courage and forgiveness. And these are the vessels that never break. The kiln's breath may fade, but the warmth it gave remains tucked in every cup and every story shared. May you find that same warmth tonight, wrapped in your own memories, surrounded by the soft glow of your quiet strength. Thank you for listening, friend. Thank you for sharing this gentle journey with me. May your dreams be soft, your rest deep, and your heart light, with the knowledge that even in the smallest, quietest moments, you are enough. Good night.